Good morning, Monday morning. We are back with Beowulf, Dragon Slayer, Chapter 5. I think I'm going to try to read the rest of the story today because I'm going to be moving my classroom to my house. That's exciting for you kids because you'll get a chance to meet my dog and my cat and maybe even my children as they leap in front of the webcam. But I hope to have the rest of this story up today. And there's a story that was written from the opposite side, the opposite perspective of Beowulf, of the monster and what it's like to be the monster. And when you read the two books side by side, I don't know, it makes a really cool picture and seeing something from more than one perspective. So I'm going to try to get my hands on that book and start a read aloud for that one that you can check out once you're done going through Beowulf. Also today I posted the text online so you can actually read the story. Maybe while you're watching this video, you can be reading along. So check that out. All right. Let me just do a sound check. Looks like sounding pretty good. And let's read some more Beowulf. We're on chapter 5. Chapter 5, titled Terror Comes Again. But the time when men might sleep safely in the king's hall was not yet come. Grendel had fled away over the moors with the life streaming from his mortal wound, seeking the dark of his lair, like a wild animal that has its death hurt. But he'd not died alone as a wild animal dies in the dreadful sea cavern where they dwelt. His mother had been waiting his return. She was of the same kind as Grendel, monstrous, evil, a death shadow in the dark. But she had possessed the power to love, and she had loved her son, and was therefore more terrible than he had ever been. Now, mad with grief as a bitch wolf whose cubs are taken from her, panting for revenge, she followed the day-old blood trail to the threshold of Herat and hurled back the door. Within was a sudden dreadful uproar. Men sprang from their sleeping benches, snatching up their weapons, but as no blade could bite on her son's charmed hide, so none could bite on hers. She surged forward, heedless of all that they could do against her, and with a triumphant yell she grasped Asker, whom the king loved best of all his thanes, and the next instant was gone with him into the night. Lamentation swept through Herat, where so short a time before had been laughter and the song of the harp. Word was carried to the king, and he came and stood among them with his gray beard wild from his pillow and the tears of grief for Asker, his friend, trickling down the deep-cut lines of his stern face. Beowulf and his comrades, weary after their struggle of the night before, slept deep and dreamlessly, and heard no sound until Beowulf woke in the first grayness of the dawn to find a hand shaking his shoulder and a voice crying in his ear that he must come to Hrothgar the king. He flung a cloak round his nakedness and with his comrades went out after the messenger and across the wet grass under the apple trees to Herat the Hart. He found Hrothgar seated in his high seat, no longer weeping, but with his face as if it were turned to stone. "My lord Hrothgar, what has happened here in the night?" The old man stared straight before him, and his voice was dull and hard. "Evil has returned to Herat." "What evil? Surely Grendel has not come again? What evil? Tell me." "Grendel? Nay, not Grendel. I've heard men speak before now, have seen not one but two night stalkers among the moorland mists, and one of them in some sort like a woman. Fool that I was, and thrice cursed fool, I paid no heed to the tale. But now I know all too surely that the tale was true. Dead is Asker, my counselor and shoulder-to-shoulder man. Many times we strove side by side in battle, shedding our blood together and sharing the mead horn afterwards. And now he is dead, slain by the foul kinswoman of the monster whom you slew." Beowulf straightened himself and shook off the last rags of sleep that still clung about him. "I have still my strength, Hrothgar the king, and still it is at your service." Nothing changed in the stony face of the old king, only his hands clenched and unclenched on the carved four-posts of the seat. "Save us from this new horror, Beowulf, as you saved us from the other. You alone can do it. Yet, not even you can bring back to life Asker, who is near to me as my own heart." "Sorrow not so grievously," Beowulf said quickly. "It is better that a man should avenge his friend than mourn him overmuch. Each of us must wait the end of life, and if a man gain honor while he lives, as Asker gained it, that is best for a warrior when the time comes that Weird cuts the web of his living from the loom. Abide but this one day, and your friend shall not lie unavenged, though I cannot bring him back to you." He covered the clenched hands with his own and looked into the stricken face of the king. "Listen and believe me. Not in earth's breast, nor in the fiery heart of the mountains, or in the black depths of the sea, shall the she-wolf escape my coming." Hrothgar drew a long breath and seemed to draw in strength with it as a gift from the young champion. Light came again to his eyes, and he got slowly to his full height and looked about him. "Have my horse saddled and others for Beowulf and whoever chooses to ride with us. We are for the wolf woman's lair." Beowulf strode away to his own quarters, and even before the horses had been brought round, he had returned wearing the ring-mail sark that was as fine as a salmon's skin, and his own close-fitting helmet, and carrying his sword. And before the sun had risen clear of the rim of the hills, he and Hrothgar, with a mingled company of Danes and Geats behind him, were pressing onward to across the waste, wet mosses of the moors, following Grendel's blood trails towards the seashore. Far down the coast from the fjord, with its shingle strand where the Geatish war galley lay behind her barricade of oars, was a very different place, a sea inlet between two steep nesses, with a narrow opening to the sea outside. Along the base of the cliffs lay black shelving rocks where the sea beasts basked at noontide, and others that were jagged and fanged like sea beasts themselves. And the waves of the open sea, driven into the confined space, boiled and weltered as in a cauldron. At the landward end of this evil place, a stream coming down from the high moors had cut for itself through the years a deep gorge overhung with a tangle of sere and salt-burned trees that dripped gray lichen into the gray mists of the falling water and the spume that beat up from the churning waves below, a place of ill omen, a dreadful place of which men told many stories. Stories of giant shapes half glimpsed in the sea mists, of strange sounds echoing and strange lights flaring beneath the water, and storms that blew up out of nowhere, and strange tides that set there. Well, elsewhere among the coast, the winds and the tides were fair. Land animals shunned the place, they say, and if a deer hard pressed by the hounds were driven to the edge of the stream, it would turn there on the bank and die rather than plunge into the water and swim for safety. To this place, Grendel's blood trail led the Geatish and Danish warriors, and on the cliff edge above it, lying abandoned like some fragment of a mouse that a great cat had dropped from its jaws, they found Asker's head, where Grendel's dam had torn it off before she plunged down into her lair. Dismounting, the thanes gathered about it in silence. Hrothgar, in the midst, knelt stiffly beside the last dreadful relic of his dead sword brother and put back the tangle of blood-soaked hair with hands as gentle as a woman's. But he spoke no word. There was no word to speak. In a short while he rose, saying to the thanes about him, "Hobble the horses. From here we must go on foot." And there's a picture of Hrothgar kneeling down to see Asker's head, and Beowulf is standing behind him. You can see the spears of the warriors along with them that they're holding back here. One by one, following the old king and the young hero, they dropped over the edge out of the morning sunlight and began the long climb down through the rocks and tree roots of the dark gorge to the foot of the cliffs. As they went, it seemed to every man that a cold murk, a shadow that was more than the headlands cutting off the light of day, rose about them, deadening heart and spirit. A shadow that grew chiller and more deadly with every downward step they took. At last the gorge widened. The stream sprang out over a ledge and plunged down to join the churning waters of the sea hole. And following it, they came scrambling out from a world of trees into a world of spray-lashed rocks. On the rock ledges, the great tusked seals and walruses lay basking. Another menace to be outfaced, and all among the rocks the water was fouled with murky crimson as slow gouts of blood still came welling up from below. The roar of the water was in their ears, but under the roar, like the still depths far down beneath the fret and turmoil of the surface waves, was a great silence. No seabirds cried in this place, and the silence, like a shadow, pressed upon the heart. One of the Danes had brought a war horn with him, and in a gesture of defiance he put the silver mouthpiece to his lips and set the dim gorge and the gloom beneath the trees echoing with an eager battle music. The echoes flung back and forth along the base of the cliffs, splintering on the sheer rock faces, and the sea beasts, roused from their sleep, plunged roaring and bellowing into the water. Beowulf snatched a bow from the gate, who stood nearest to him. "An arrow, quick, an arrow, Scaife." And when the other gave it to him, he notched it to the bowstring and drew and loosed in one swift movement. The arrow sped out into the midst of the threshing herd and stood quivering in the neck of a huge bull walrus. The men with him set up a shout, and some began to scramble out along the weed-slippery rocks. A dozen spears and sharp walrus hooks were in the body of the wildly struggling beast, and he was dragged to land and killed with a blow behind the head from a heavy shield rim. For a few moments the Geats and Danes gathered to stare and exclaim over it, for it was a great brute and would yield much ivory. But it was not for walrus hunting that they'd come to this accursed place, and almost at once they turned away to the true venture in hand. Beowulf had no preparations to make. He was already clad in his ringmail sark, his boar-crested helm pulled low upon his brow, his sword in his hand, not the king's gift sword, but his own weapon he'd carried through many a fight by sea and land, and which fitted his grasp as if hand and hilt had been made for each other. But he was not, after all, to carry his own sword into the fight that was waiting for him, for at the last instant Hunferth, the king's jester, the bitter-tongued and flame-tempered, pulled the sword from his own wolf-skin sheath and came shouldering through the other warriors to thrust it half angrily into Beowulf's hand. "Here, take my sword. Hrunting, men call it. The blade was tempered with brew of poisoned twigs and hardened with battle blood. It is a powerful blade and has never yet failed its man in combat." Beowulf looked from the jester's face to the wave-gray blade in his hand and slowly back again. This was the man who'd flung insults in his teeth only 2 nights since. But he saw Hunferth regretted the insults now, and for him that was enough. He passed his own sword to the nearest of the Geats and took the weapon which the other held out to him, smiling a little into his hot, dark eyes. "Friend, I thank you for the loan. With Hrunting, or surely not at all, I will overcome this wolf woman of the sea." Then he turned to the king standing by. "Hrothgar, lord of the Danes, I go now, and whether we shall meet again is as Weird may choose." If I do not return, I pray you send those gifts which you gave to me home to Higelac, my own hearth lord, all save the great sword. Let you give that to Hunferth your jester, as a gift from a friend in place of his sword Hrunting, which will have perished with me. For a long moment the jester's sword naked across his thigh, he stood looking about him as the distant sunlight that he could see touching golden on the high crests of the headlands and the clear blue of the open sea beyond, wondering if ever he would feel the lifting deck of his warboat beneath his feet again, looking into the troubled faces of one after another of his sword brothers and wondering if that also was for the last time. "Wait for me here," he said. Then he turned from them all and with the great sword held above his head plunged down into the surf. And that's the end of chapter 5. The exciting confrontation between Beowulf and the she-wolf, Grendel's mother, will come in next chapter, chapter 6, titled The Sea Hag.